We're going to look at Ezekiel 40 to 48 this evening. And I saved this because this is notoriously a challenging section for what do we do with this. And so I've actually been thinking about this for months on end and reading stuff just to get ready because I wanted to be as clear as possible, hopefully. And so let me pray for us, and we'll endeavor to look at some of this. Lord, we're grateful for your word, for all of it. All of it is profitable. And your word gives us such a perspective on history, both the past, the present, and the future. And we ask for your help to look at the text with clarity and with consistency in the way we approach it in its plain, normal sense. And we would ask, Lord, that you would benefit us in our study and that we would be excited at your glory, your presence, and your sovereignty as Ezekiel portrays those. So we ask for help in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, we've been looking at Ezekiel. This is our third lesson on Ezekiel. And the outline I've been using for the whole book is really pretty simple. There's a threefold division. I called chapters 1 to 3 the paradigm of God's presence. In other words, God's desires to fill the creation with his glorious presence. And then the problem of God's presence in chapters 4 to 32, which is Israel's present condition. They're dead. Then you have the pinnacle of God's presence in chapters 33 to 48, which kind of, in a way, is like the mirror image of the problem section, because their problem of being dead is resolved by God bringing them back together, restoring them, and regenerating them, bringing the new covenant for them, and all of those things. And so we looked at how all that worked, and so I'll just kind of leave that to the prior lessons. Chapter 40 to 48, really in summary, Ezekiel has a vision of a temple and sacrifices that go on in the temple. And the reason why I want to spend a whole lesson on this is because there's all kinds of views on how to understand this temple. There's those who reject it outright and say, like, no, there can't be a structural temple. This must be symbolic for something. And then they'll say, well, these sacrifices can't be like literal animal sacrifices. And so how do we understand those things? That's what we want to kind of cover. But let me give you this quote starting off by Jason Beals, not to be confused with G.K. Beale, who's also written a lot on the temple. But Jason has written a dissertation on this very passage and issue, and I would commend it to you. Very helpful. His dissertation is called, "Does God Require a House of Cedar? The Purpose of the Eschatological Temple." So drawing a lot on him, and I'll give you some other further resources if you're interested. This is kind of a nerdy subject, though, so I don't know who will be interested. But anyway, here's a quote that he gives to kind of wrap up the second half of Ezekiel. He says this, quote, "The restoration section of Ezekiel in chapters 33 to 48 connects themes and motifs from the previous judgment section of chapters 1 to 32. The prophet emphasizes a reversal from judgment to restoration, from exile to return, from alienation to relationship with Yahweh, from a defiled and destroyed sanctuary to a new, glorious, and holy sanctuary on a very high mountain. The nation that was punished because of her covenant unfaithfulness and treachery, which experienced the curses of the Mosaic covenant, will now enter into a new relationship and a new covenant with Yahweh. The nation that was removed from the land will also be returned to the land. The nation who once walked in disobedience with a heart of stone will one day be able to walk in obedience because of a new heart. The departure of Yahweh's glory from a defiled temple will return to a magnificent, expanded, eschatological temple. The nation's evil shepherds that exploited God's sheep will be replaced by a good shepherd, the Davidic king who will feed his sheep. In short, Ezekiel 37, which he's talking about in the context here of this quote, Ezekiel 37 emphasizes the reversal of God's judgment concerning the nation, the land, and Yahweh's dwelling place. The prophet underscores a complete reversal of judgment on both a physical and spiritual level. That's a long quote. The summary of it is there's this transition from judgment to restoration. Right? What God judges them for, he restores them point for point in the end of the book. So that's that's his point there. And so in a way, this section 40 to 48 has been kind of the Gordian knot of Old Testament interpretation. Many brothers in the Lord have no place for this being a physical structure and literal sacrifices. Let me give you a quote from a theologian named Sam Storms. He says this, quote, "Any discussion of a future temple is incredulously dismissed as retrogression or an affront to the person and work of Christ and the church. It is the worst imaginable redemptive regression and a repudiation of the church," end quote. Tell us what you really think, Sam. Now, I think Sam's a brother in the Lord, he's agree with him on a lot of things, not eschatology. But man, that is some inflammatory talk, and I just disagree with him. So I'm just going to lay on my cards. I think this is a literal temple. I think these are literal sacrifices based upon just a normal, plain hermeneutic that you apply. But that raises a whole bunch of questions that you got to answer and what we do with it. So that's what we want to do tonight. And often one of the big issues is, well, this contradicts the book of Hebrews. And some will point to that certain passages there. For instance, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 18, which we read, "Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any any offering for sin." And so they'll say, see, look, you can't go back to this. They'll claim that this is a return to the Mosaic covenant, which I don't think it is, and a repudiation of the work of Christ, which I don't think it is. So, strong rhetoric aside, what do we do with these chapters? Now, those who would say this is not a structural temple and that would say it is not literal sacrifices, in a way, I think have the burden of proof on them because there is so much detail. 9 chapters of incredible detail. It seems like if this was a symbolic point, you could have just made that in a lot shorter of a period. Shorter of a distance. So the book of Ezekiel is about God's glory and God's presence, his glorious presence. And the structure that shows God's presence is the temple. And there seems to be a symmetry in the book where the the glory of God departs from a structural temple, only to be reversed in this eschatological temple where the glory returns to that. So it seems, as on the face of it, that those who were receiving Ezekiel's prophecy would have understood that first temple in which the glory departed to be a physical structure. Everyone would agree on that. And it would also seem that when Ezekiel starts talking about another physical structure, that he would be referring to a literal structure where God's glory returns. It's really hard, I think, to make the case that the original hearers could possibly understand something other than a structural temple. That makes sense to me, at least. So God's glory returns in this section, and there's a construction of this temple, reconstruction of Jerusalem, and God's glory returns and fills the temple. And really, the book is even structured this way, where there's 2 watchman sections. Chapter 3, Ezekiel's a watchman, and really to see the glory depart. And then chapter 33, for that second section, he's a watchman to see it return again. And so there's a symmetry in the book that fits. Let me just give you a brief overview of how these chapters work. Chapters 40 to 42 really deal with a description of the various parts of the temple, its gates, its buildings. There's some auxiliary buildings, and it's just describing those in 40 to 42. Then in 43 to 46, you have primarily a focus on not only the glory filling the temple, but also a description of sacrifices and festivals that will take place. And the Zadokian priesthood, who will administer that. Chapter 47 then is a pretty well-known section where you have this water that flows out from the temple, from this eschatological temple, and essentially it starts small, but as it progresses out, it gets deeper and deeper. And here's the image. Just like Eden was likely on a high mountain, because, and you're like, how do we know that? Well, because waters flowed from the garden. And so water has to flow downward. So it was a high up place that water's flowing to these other parts. And so it is with this eschatological Jerusalem. There are going to be some massive geographical changes to Jerusalem as we presently know it, where it's going to be lifted up as a high mountain. I mean, we know that when Jesus returns, he splits the Mount of Olives, and there's going to be some massive changes there. So it's this high elevated place. And there's, in Ezekiel 47, water flowing from this. It goes to the Mediterranean and it goes to the Dead Sea, and it makes the Dead Sea fresh and cleanses that. What that place was known for judgment, for Sodom, where probably the location of Sodom and Gomorrah, is now cleansed, and it's like a reversal of judgment. And so that happens. There's it's a great fisherman passage. They're fishing in the sea, in the sea there. Dead Sea. And then what you have really at the end of chapter 47 and into 48 is the division of the land. It's divided to the tribes of Israel, and they get the full inheritance of the land that they were promised in the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 15. And then finally, the book ends with this statement, which is so glorious and really just helps solidify the theme of the book as God's presence, as it talks about the New Jerusalem in chapter 48, verse 35. The circumference of the city shall be 18,000 cubits, and the name of the city from that time on shall be Yahweh is there. That's going to be the name of this new city. So that's really the flow of this section. Okay. What Ezekiel describes is a temple unlike any other temple that has been built in history. It's much larger in its dimensions than any of the temples they built. Even when they returned after exile under Ezra and Nehemiah, they didn't build this temple, which is interesting because you would think you're like, why wouldn't they build that? And I think partly is because they understood it to be an eschatological temple and one that the Messiah himself builds. And so they don't build this. They build Zerubbabel's temple, which is expanded by Herod. And the dimensions don't match any of the other temples. So it's a temple that has never been built before in Israel's history. What's also helpful to remember is that sometimes people will go like, oh, Ezekiel 40 to 48, and they make it seem like this is the only passage that talks about a future temple. But that's not the case. There are lots of Old Testament passages. I was like amazed at how many there are that just make a passing reference to an eschatological temple of the Messiah. So that's interesting. We'll look at some of those in a moment. Okay, so let me give just a few more preliminaries. I'll open up for some questions, and then we'll get into some of the issues here. Really, in history, I think you could say there have been and will be a total of 4 structural temples. Okay, so first temple is the temple that Solomon built. Before that, they had the tabernacle, right? They had the tent that was built, and that was kind of mobile. But then there was to be a physical structure built in Jerusalem, and that's Solomon's temple. Solomon builds that. Who destroys that temple? Yeah, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon destroys it, right? And it's in 586 BC. So they go into exile. They're taken. Northern kingdom went into Assyria. Southern kingdom goes to Babylon. They return, and they rebuild the temple and under Ezra and Nehemiah. And that is known as Zerubbabel's temple. It's also known as Herod's temple. Or if you hear people talk about the second temple period, well, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the period of that second temple when Zerubbabel builds it, and then Herod comes along and he expands the kind of the footprint of it and makes it a little bit more spectacular build and adds on to it. That temple is the temple that's in existence when Jesus is on the earth. That's the temple that he goes to, is Zerubbabel Herod's temple. That temple is destroyed by what nation? Rome in 70 AD. It's really well attested in history. So that temple is destroyed. However, Paul talks about another temple, a third temple, that will be really an apostate temple, I think we could say, in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. And he's talking about the context of the day of the Lord, which we know is the tribulation period, that 7-year period before the Lord returns. And he says, verse 3, let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. And so he talks about a temple, a sanctuary that's present during this future day of the Lord period. And there are a subset. I wouldn't say that there's a majority probably, but Jews have lots of different views on lots of different things. But there are a subset of Jews who do want to rebuild a temple. That's certainly not the case for all of them. But we would not be in support of that at all. I mean, we know it will happen, but they're estranged from their Messiah. They don't need to build a temple. They need to repent and trust their Messiah. But it seems that Paul understands this to be a physical temple, and that this Antichrist figure is going to go into, which seems to be what Jesus referred to and Daniel referred to as the abomination of desolation, where he exalts himself, and it's very much similar to what Antiochus Epiphanes does in the second temple, where he sacrifices a pig in the temple, in the Jewish temple, as kind of like a paradigm for what this future world ruler will do. And so that's the third temple. And then there's a fourth temple that we see in Scripture, and that is the millennial temple. And that's referred to in Ezekiel 40 to 48, and it's referred to in a number of other places as well, some of which we'll look at tonight. And then in the eternal state, so the millennial temple is during the millennium. It's during that 1,000-year reign of Christ, as we understand it. And then in the eternal state, after the millennium, Revelation 21:22 tells us that in the city of the New Jerusalem, there is no temple there. So there's no temple. And what's also interesting is there's also no sea, right? The sea is not there in the eternal state. And so some big changes. And one of the things is interesting, in the Ezekiel temple in the millennium, what happens? The water, 47, flows out and it goes to the sea, right? The Mediterranean. So you're like, okay, that can't fit. So in the eternal state, there's similarities, but there's also some differences. So, okay, 4 temples: Solomon's, Zerubbabel, tribulation, and millennial. You can call them different things if you want, but essentially that's the structure. All right. I don't want to lose anyone. Any questions so far? Just clarifications or on any of this?
What was your overall book outline point for 40 through 48?
I think for 33 to 39, I called it regeneration and restoration, and 40 to 48, I called it return and rebuilding.
It's not a P, brother.
Yeah, I know, but it was a subpoint under the pinnacle. Subpoint under pinnacle of God's presence. There you go. I'll work on it. It's my homework.
That's all right.
Yeah.
I didn't realize it was a sub of pinnacle. It makes sense that it would be. Okay.
Yeah. Just trying to divide those two sections.
Yeah.
The fourth temple is
There's one we're talking about tonight.
not the tribulation temple.
Yeah.
This is
Yeah.
the end one.
Okay, so let's start with, leave the sacrifice aside. Let's just talk about the structure. We got 2 things to do, really. We got to talk about the structure. Is it structure? Is there an actual building, or is it symbolic? Second question, if there is a structural temple, then are there sacrifices? That's the second question. You don't really have to deal with sacrifices if you're going to say that the temple is symbolic, because then it's easy to say that. You got to do both, though. If you're going to say that one, to be consistent, you're going to say the temple's symbolic, you got to say the sacrifices are symbolic. You're going to say the temple's structural, you got to say the sacrifices. I think you do, to be consistent. So let's talk about, there's really just 2 views. There's sub-views, but non-structural, structural. Okay, so the non-structural views, here's what one representative, Robert Strimple, he concisely summarizes his position when he states, quote, "Since Christ is the true temple, we are to look for no other," end quote. That's the logic, essentially, because Christ is, he's the temple, so therefore, we don't need another temple. Yet Jason Beals, that is, points out, quote, "While the New Testament does recognize Jesus' body, the church, and the individual Christian as a temple of God, this by no means cancels out a future temple in Jerusalem." Interestingly enough, when the church is referred to by Paul as a temple of the Lord, as either individually or corporately in that metaphor, he never uses fulfillment language. He's never saying like this fulfills the Old Testament temple. It just fits in the paradigm of that. So sometimes theologians have a knee-jerk reaction to lean towards an either or instead of seeing sometimes that it's a both and, right? So we have to just always have that kind of in our back pocket. Like, is this trying to set up an either or? Like, you can only have Christ and the church as temple and not a structural temple. It's either or can you have both? Can there be multiple aspects of temple that can exist at the same time? I think there can. I'll give you an example. I mean, I'm getting ahead of myself, but Ezekiel himself gives us the paradigm for multiple senses of temple. Chapter 1, he sees this chariot throne, which really represents God's cosmic presence that fills the entire earth. It's like the whole earth is this temple. And so you have a cosmic temple. Chapter 2, Ezekiel falls down as if he's dead. The Spirit enters into him and raises him up, which is somewhat of a precursor of the indwelling of the individual believer. And you see that because later in the book, what happens to Ezekiel happens to the whole nation. They are dead, and what happens? The Spirit comes into them and indwells them per the new covenant. And so Ezekiel's like a mini picture of the individual indwelling. So he becomes like a mini temple. And then Ezekiel also talks about a structural temple that's present and defiled during his day, but a future structural temple that will be restored. So Ezekiel doesn't have any problem having multiple temples going at the same time. Like the space-time continuum theologically continues, you can have multiple senses. So I don't really buy that if Christ is referred to as a temple, if believers are referred to as a temple, that it somehow cancels out when we're not told that it actually does that. So there are a lot of different views of the non-structural and here's, I think, one of the weaknesses of the non-structural view. Because once you say this is not structural, and these are not literal sacrifices, then you start to have to say, well, then it's symbolic of something. And this is where commentators just go all over the place, and it just becomes subjectivity land. There's no objectivity. And the reason is there's all these different views that say, oh, well, it's symbolic of this. It's symbolic of the church. It's symbolic of the new heavens and new earth. It's symbolic of Christ. It's symbolic of, all these different things. And you go, which one is right? How do I know which one's right? Because it seems like it's just up to the interpreter to then come up with what seems best. And that just seems challenging to me. It just seems on the face of it that they would not have understood this in any other way. Like if you're the original reader and you've got a temple and your temple just got destroyed because it was defiled, but then he says, but God's he's going to reverse all this stuff. And one of the things he's going to reverse is a temple. So you'd be thinking, what? Structural temple. Yeah, that's what you're going to be thinking. So that seems to be a big issue. Another issue is, like I mentioned, so much detail. I mean, Ezekiel, dude, you could have saved a bunch of scrolls. If you just told us, that this was representative of something else. Also, there's a purpose clause in Ezekiel 43, verse 7, which says, and he said to me, Son of man, this is the place of my throne and the place of the soles of my feet where I will dwell in the midst of the people of Israel forever. And the house of Israel shall no more defile my holy name, neither they nor their kings nor their whorings by their dead bodies of their kings and their high places. Well, that's not the verse. That's a good verse, but... wait. Maybe it was the verse right before it. I think I wrote down the wrong verse, but there's a passage that essentially says, hey, I'm revealing these things to you so that you will know to do it, basically, down to the details. So it's not just like hypothetical, but he's... Verse 10. Oh, thank you. Thanks. As for you, son of man, describe to the house of Israel the temple, that they may be ashamed of their iniquities, and they may measure the plan. And it'll go on and talk about basically so that they can build this thing. So those are the non-structural views. Then there's the structural view. The argument here is really there's a symmetry in the book. Beale says this, quote, God's glory is a cosmic presence not contained in the temple, chapters 1-3, yet his glory does depart from the temple because of the abominations of Israel in chapters 8-11, and will return again to a new and different temple under a new covenant, chapters 40-48. So I've said this a number of times, just going to repeat, because this is kind of like, some of this is like, you got to really just, repetition's the key to learning. the symmetry fits so well for a structural temple that he sees all this defilement in God's temple, and he sees now a restoration of that where they're actually functioning as they were meant to. The detailed measurements and descriptions argue for a structural temple. Let's see. Ralph Alexander, he's another commentator, he says this, quote, "To interpret these chapters in any manner other than a normal literal approach would appear to contradict the interpretive guide in the vision who warns Ezekiel that he is to write down all the minute details concerning the plan for the temple and its regulations so that those details might be considered carefully and followed in every aspect." 10 and 11. He's got the verses right. Not only that, though, not only do we have the detail there, it fits the symmetry of the book, but we have many other passages that speak about a structural temple in the future kingdom. Here's one. There's just too many to look at them all, but here's one, Isaiah 2. And we studied Isaiah not too long ago. Isaiah 2. Actually, Isaiah 2 and 4, the beginning of 2, the beginning of 4, really serve as like a bookends for the kingdom. On one end, you have like what the kingdom conditions will be. On the other end, the kingdom conditions. In the middle, the present, junk that's happening. And notice what he says in chapter 2, verse 1. "The word that Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, it shall come to pass in the latter days," so he locates it in the future, "that the mountain of the house of Yahweh," so the mountain of the house. So the mountain is Zion, right? It's Jerusalem, and the house is the temple, right? The house of Yahweh is the temple. "Shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted up above the hills, and all the nations shall flow to it. And many people shall come and say, 'Come, let us go up to the mountain of Yahweh, to the house of the God of Jacob.'" So once again, the house of the God of Jacob. So it's referring to a temple. So Isaiah is talking about a physical temple. And we've already talked about, Ezekiel 47, it's this high mountain, water's flowing from it, and the nations are going to come to this high mountain, which is Jerusalem and Zion. And there's this house of the Lord there, which is, I don't know how you understand that other than a structural building. So here's the purpose, verse 3, "that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go the law and the word of Yahweh from Jerusalem. And he shall judge between nations and decide disputes for many peoples. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more." So the Messiah is present. His headquarters are the house of the Lord, the temple. The nations are flocking to its particular times to Jerusalem for wisdom, for teaching. It's like the greatest seminary of all. It's the master seminary, right? It's like, and they're coming to hear it. They're having disputes handled among them, and there's world peace because their weapons of warfare have been dismantled. So just an incredible time. And Isaiah visions, part of that includes a temple. Here's another passage in Ezekiel. Ezekiel 37. This is getting close to 40 to 48. So verse 37, or chapter 37. This is the context of the valley of the dry bones, where Israel's scattered about. God's going to regather them. Then his spirit will enter into them. He'll restore them, resurrect them. And here's kind of how it ends, starting at verse 24. "My servant David shall be king over them." And when he refers to David, he's referring to Messiah, because David's long dead. So "my servant David shall be king over them, and they shall all have one shepherd. They shall walk in my rules and be careful to obey my statutes. They shall dwell in the land that I gave to my servant Jacob, where your fathers lived. They and their children's children shall dwell there forever. And David, my servant, shall be their prince forever. I will make a covenant of peace with them." That's the new covenant. "It shall be an everlasting covenant with them. And I will set them in their land and multiply them and will set my sanctuary in their midst forevermore." Okay, so the sanctuary, what does that refer to? It's the temple. "My dwelling place," verse 27, that's a reference to the temple, "shall be with them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Then the nations will know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies Israel when my sanctuary is in their midst forevermore." You're like, wow, like 3 times he says my sanctuary or my dwelling place. So those are 3 indications of, and this is really important to get at some of the objections to this. what Ezekiel's saying is this doesn't happen until Israel experiences the new covenant. So what that should tell us is Ezekiel's temple is not a Mosaic covenant temple. It is a new covenant temple. Because that's one of the objections people say, oh, you're regressing back to the Mosaic covenant, which has been fulfilled in Christ and is made obsolete according to Hebrews 8. And we say yes and amen. And Ezekiel would say yes and amen. Guys, this happens. This cannot happen. Israel cannot have the temple that they need and serve in it in the way that God intended until they have the new covenant, until they have the new heart, until they have this circumcision of the heart. So that's one. Another key text. But here's another one. Haggai. One of the minor prophets. He talks. So here's the context of Haggai. Haggai's one of those post-exilic prophets who's encouraging the people. He's like, get your priorities straight, people. You guys got your own houses. The house of the Lord is not being built. So start building the house of the Lord. So he's actually encouraging them to build Zerubbabel's temple number 2. And yet when the people who saw the first temple and they see the second temple, they're weeping. They're like, this is nothing like Solomon's temple. And so we read in, in verse 3 of chapter 2, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? How do you see it now? Is it not as nothing in your eyes? And so they're like, man, this is like nothing like Solomon's temple. But then if we jump down to verse 6, it says this, for thus says Yahweh of hosts, yet once more, in a little while, I will shake the heavens and the earth and the sea and the dry land, and I will shake all nations, so that the treasures of all nations shall come in, and I will fill this house with glory, says Yahweh of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares Yahweh of hosts. The latter glory of this house shall be greater than the former, says Yahweh of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares Yahweh of hosts. So here's the logic of Haggai. He's saying, I know, this is not a great house of the Lord. You guys saw the Solomonic temple. This one seems kind of pitiful in comparison. But let me tell you, in the future, there's another house of the Lord that's coming. And its glory is going to be greater than the former glory. And so the context is, it just seems to fit that he's talking about a structural temple that's greater than the prior ones. All right, one more, Zechariah. You're killing us, Robert. Oh, I'm not killing you. There are so many others. It's crazy how many references there are. Zechariah chapter 1. Zechariah talks about the temple a ton, the future temple. Zechariah 1, verse 16. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, I have returned to Jerusalem with mercy. My house shall be built in it, declares Yahweh of hosts, and the measuring line shall be stretched out over Jerusalem. Now, we could argue and get into the context and see why that's an eschatological reference and not referring to the Zerubbabel temple, but we don't have time to do that. Let me give you even more explicit text in chapter 6, verse 12 to 15. Zechariah 6, verses 12 to 15, he's talking now about the Messiah who will be the one who unites king and priesthood in one individual. Of course, Jesus is the prophet, priest, and king. So chapter 6, verse 12, and say to him, thus says Yahweh of hosts, behold, the man whose name is the branch. Okay, so Jesus' messianic title is branch man. It's all over the place. Jeremiah 23, okay, he's the branch. So behold, the man whose name is the branch, for he shall branch out from his place, and he shall build the temple of Yahweh. Just pause there for a second. It's like, okay, the Messiah will build now here's what the other view will say. They'll say, he's going to build the church. I'll build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Now, the problem with that is there is no chance that anyone of Zechariah's hearers would go, oh yeah, the church. Because the church is a mystery. It's not revealed in the Old Testament. Paul tells us that. It's something new. It's a new man. And so it's special pleading. He's talking about the actual structure. The Messiah will build the temple of Yahweh. It is he who shall build the temple of Yahweh and shall bear royal honor and shall sit and rule on his throne. And there shall be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace shall be between them both. And the crown shall be in the temple of Yahweh as a reminder to Helam, Tobijah, Jediah, and Hen, the son of Zephaniah. So he unites the two, and the temple then becomes like the center, the place of his throne, the place of the Davidic throne in the millennial kingdom is the temple. That's where he reigns from. And it's the central place of it's like the central United Nations, if you will, and Messiah rules from that place. So there's more, but those are a few passages that really seem to indicate a future structural temple. Okay, pause there. Question, does that make sense? Is that following along?
Fourth temple.
This is the fourth. This is the millennial temple. This is
Do we have any reference to the third temple? Who builds it, when, and all that?
no.
Prior to
What's that?
Prior to tribulation, but
Yeah, I think I would simply, if we just pull up a few pieces together, we're like kind of sanctified common sense. It's really hard to imagine how another temple could be built just because of all the political, and just tension there. But it seems to me that Paul's saying there is some existence of a temple, at least at the midpoint of the tribulation, which is 3.5 years in, for the abomination to happen. Who knows how long it takes to build such a temple, but it happens at some point in those first 3.5 years, such that there is a temple for this man of lawlessness, Antichrist, to do this thing in that structure. Whether or not that happens within the tribulation only, and that would seem to fit in my mind, that you have this figure who is going to bring a false world peace and unite a bunch of nations. He'd be such a powerful leader and have great wisdom that he could solve the problem in the Middle East and basically go, hey, we'll sort this out in some way and allow them to have a temple built.
Excuse me, but for that matter, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is there now.
Yeah.
And some Antichrist figure that is able, with great power, to unite these two warring groups. He can decide, we'll knock this off there, we'll do this here, we'll compromise, you know what I mean? I don't think it even requires a massive building plan, just a modification plan.
Yeah.
Would that not fit?
Well, yeah, I just think, however it works out, and this is, we're speculating, of course.
Jews and Arabs together.
Yeah, we're speculating, but I think at some point, somehow, there's some agreement. Daniel tells us that there's some kind of treaty or agreement or covenant, he says, that takes place, Daniel 9:27, between this figure, this lawless one, the false shepherd, and Israel is duped by him, and they make a covenant with him for whatever reason. It's at the beginning of the tribulation, and it says that he breaks that covenant at the midpoint. So I think that coincides with the abomination of desolation. So they're on peaceful terms with the Antichrist until the middle point, and it's at that point that he goes into the temple. He says, I'm God, and he, does whatever this abomination is, whether it's sacrificing an animal or whatever, but he turns on them, and then he starts relentlessly persecuting them. And of course, we can see more context for that in Matthew 24. We'll look at it in Luke 21 on the Olivet Discourse and kind of Jesus' instructions to that generation on how to respond to that. So anyway, does that kind of answer your question a little bit?
it does.
Raise a few more?
Well, it was one of the references talking about he's going to build and it's going to be, you're going to basically forever.
Okay, the forever language.
Yeah.
So, okay.
But then you said the fifth one is the
Yeah. So that's really a great question. The forever language often has the connotation in Hebrew of till the end of the age. And there are transitions of ages, right? So there's the past age, there's the present age, and I think there is a transition of sorts that takes place, like an age change between the end of what we call the millennial kingdom and the beginning of the eternal state. It's a massive transition in history. And so you have they'll talk about the age to come, which is, in Old Testament language, is the time of expectation. The latter days is really a whole section of time, which we're in right now, that is the time of fulfillment. Now, there's lots of things that haven't been fulfilled, but we're in that time where things are being fulfilled, things that related to Christ's first coming, related to Christ's second coming. So I wouldn't get too hung up on that forever language like we think in Western terms of it has to mean infinity into the future, through the eternal state. I think it just means until the end of the next epoch is the idea in the Hebrew Hebrew understanding of it. So, and that's usually pretty agreed upon, honestly, I think, among differing people, even of eschatological perspectives, that it's kind of till the end of that era of God's working. Does that make sense? So,
Why then in the English translations do they sometimes say end of the age and other times they say forever? Is there some clue in the linguistic?
I have to look into that. Yeah. Nothing that's come to mind specifically, what the significance of difference would be. Yeah.
those of us who are new, not newbie at all, but just what do we believe again? On the premillennial age and the tribulation, so it's like it's pre-trib is first.
Yeah. So Christ
is first.
Yeah.
3.5 years of Christ.
Let's just assume that today, Christ takes us up. He raptures the church, resurrects us. We meet those who have died in the Lord since Acts 2, since the beginning of the church. We're in heaven with the Lord, resurrected. The tribulation begins, 7 years. The midpoint of that, the Antichrist turns on Israel, abomination, desolation. At the end of the 7 years, Christ returns with us, the church. He comes to the Mount of Olives, splits the Mount of Olives. That's when that happens. Israel is regenerated, saved, redeemed, and he establishes his kingdom. There's going to be quite the cleanup process. Like literally, Ezekiel will say, like, there's going to be all these bones scattered about because of all the dead people, and you're going to have to clean it up and decontaminate the place because find all the bones and put them, bury them. So there's kind of a period. Even the end of Daniel talks about a time period between Christ's return and the establishment of the kingdom, because you have this cleanup process really that takes place. And so you have that, the kingdom begins. Christ reigns from David's throne. You have this millennial temple there. You have the nations are unified. They're worshiping. And that goes on for 1,000 years, at which point we transition into the eternal state. And there's some changes there as well. So anyway, does that kind of give you the cliff notes?
Yeah, so only premillennial people would subscribe to a literal structure that he's talking about.
Yeah. And
non-millennialists or the post-millennialists, they see symbolism in all this.
And not to complicate it too much, but not even all premillennialists would agree that this is a physical temple. I mean, there's a lot of premillennialists who would not even see a future for Israel, which also they would not then see any significance to this being a structural temple with sacrifices. So, yeah.
So would a classic historical premill?
Yeah, so like historical, there's actually three main views of premillennialism. There's historic premillennialism, which really doesn't see a future for Israel necessarily as a restored nation. There's what's called Laddian premillennialism, which is George Ladd's version of premillennialism. And then there's dispensationalism, which is what I would subscribe to. It's essentially saying, yeah, we do see in Scripture, don't get hung up on weird views of dispensation. There's weird dispensationalists, just like there's weird anything. But the point being is that there's a future salvation and restoration of Israel that coincides with the reign of the Messiah on the earth. Okay. We're really getting the weeds here, but hey, I love it. Okay, do you want to make some more progress? Talk about sacrifices? Okay, so where's the place of sacrifice? So the views here are, one view is that is symbolic. And here, let me just give you some positives. And I'm going to refer you to a good article if you want to do a little, it's like 15 pages maybe. Matt Waymeyer has an article addressing this very issue, and I think he does a great job looking at the different views. But one of them, so I'm leaning on him a little bit here, the symbolic view of this basically says, well, Ezekiel's trying to write to an audience that can understand what he's talking about. He's talking about sacrifice, but we know there won't be sacrifice in the future, but he has to describe it in a way that they would understand. They understand killing animals, and so that's how he describes it. But just like future warfare might not be on horses and, chariots and swords, it might be, I don't know. But we understand that, okay, a sword can refer, like, metaphorically to just a weapon, right? So that's kind of the argument there. The counterpoint is we have the whole book of Psalms that talks about worship language that doesn't always include sacrificial terms. So it's not like Ezekiel's like out of luck to describe things. And, obviously Ezekiel's the one who tells us about the new covenant. So clearly he has terms for new covenant understandings and categories. So seems like he could do that. And they'll also make the argument that there's less detail about the sacrifices than in other places of Scripture, like in the Levitical system. And yet, the counterpoint to that is there's like 60 references to sacrifice in Ezekiel 40 to 48. So it seems like quite a bit for a smaller section. Another counterpoint, one of the problems with this is if the structural temple is literal, then so should the other be. They really have to go together. And once again, the same problem we butt up against is if this is symbolic, what is it symbolic of? And once again, we have differences of view, like, oh, it means this, it means that. And it becomes quite subjective. And once again, I'm bringing up the same argument, but it fits that you get so many chapters to describe something that's just a symbol. which seems hard to believe. The other common view is not the symbolic view, but the memorial view. And this is the idea that many good people hold to, and I think I held to it for a really long time, but I don't anymore. I don't think it's completely wrong. I just don't think it's the main point Ezekiel's making. And it's the idea that these sacrifices are like a visual reminder of the sacrifice of Christ. And the argument goes like this. Just like the sacrifice in the Old Testament looked forward to Christ's sacrifice on the cross, so these sacrifices in the future look backwards to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, and they don't compete with the sacrifice of Christ, but they're similar to, and here's the illustration of the Lord's Supper. The Lord's Supper, we don't believe is like a re-crucifying the Lord, or it's just a reminder to us of what the Lord has done. And so they'll say, in this Jewish context, this is the way for them to remember. So they make that parallel. They'll make the argument that the sacrifices in the Mosaic covenant were not efficacious, but were for those who were already in covenant with Yahweh. And they'll cite passages like the blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. Some of the problems with this is there's no indication in Ezekiel that he views these as memorial in nature. He never talks about remembrance or things like that, nor does any New Testament passage connect it that way. It also does say on 5 occasions that these sacrifices make atonement. So they do something, right? So I'm not quite there to say like they don't do anything, because they do something, and even in the Levitical system, even if they're not taking away the internal defilement of sin. I don't think that's the best explanation of what's happening. So there's a third view called the ceremonial view, or ceremonial cleansing view. You got to have better names for these. I'll work on it. But here's some of the positive arguments. When you study Leviticus, which we did a long time ago, with more careful detail, you recognize that not all the sacrifices in Leviticus dealt with sin. So we often just think like, all the sacrifices, whatever it was, burnt offering, grain offering, they all deal with sin. But they don't. There's 5 lists in the beginning of Leviticus, and 3 of them don't have any reference to sin. You've got the burnt offering, you've got the peace offering, and you've got the grain offering, and none of them explicitly deal with sin. And I know this is kind of hard to grasp, but even the sin offering doesn't always have to do with sin. You're like, how is that possible? Why did they name it that, right? But here's the thing. The sin offering is sometimes used for people who had leprosy, and they are cleansed, right? And you do a sin offering. But the problem is they didn't sin. It's not to forgive their sin for having leprosy. It's a ceremonial cleansing. Also, a woman who has a baby has to be cleansed as well. And so she didn't sin in having a baby, but there's this concept in Leviticus that's set up that is separate from internal moral defilement. It's the external clean and unclean. You have these realms of like you're clean or you're unclean, and it's this way that Israel can relate to this holy God in the temple and not be consumed. And so it doesn't take away their internal guilt. That's what author of Hebrews is trying to say. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin in that regard. However, there is some level of external ceremonial cleansing that was taking place in the Levitical system. And here's another way that the sin offerings, it's used to cleanse the altar and the temple itself. And so you're like, well, the temple didn't sin. The altar didn't sin. It's an inanimate object. So clearly you can see how even when you pay attention to the details in Leviticus, there's more going on than just a very simplistic reading of these all deal with the forgiveness of sins, because they just don't. So that's one of the issues. Another issue is how we understand the word atonement. In the New Testament, it's almost exclusively, we think of that as relating to just the forgiveness of sins, and rightly so. But in the Old Testament, in Leviticus, there's various aspects to atonement. It refers to purging or wiping away. Oftentimes, it can be for sin and for forgiveness, but at other times, it can refer to purification ceremonially, or it can refer to the consecration of objects, or even the priests. It's not because they sinned necessarily, but it's to set them apart as consecrated. And that's related to these holy and common spheres and clean and unclean distinctions. So in Ezekiel, and let me say this, okay. When it's talking about forgiveness of sins, in Leviticus, it will specify that. It'll say something like this, and this will make atonement for the forgiveness of sins. It adds that little qualifier, or it'll name the sin. And so Leviticus sets up this pattern that when you're talking specifically about atonement for sin, it says so. But there's 5 times in Ezekiel 40 to 48 where it says that these make atonement, and none of them say for the forgiveness of sins. It's never in reference to sin. 2 times it refers to the altar. 2 times it refers to the altar in chapter 43. So that's an inanimate object, so that doesn't have to do with sin. In chapter 45, verse 20, it refers to this an annual kind of cleansing of the temple itself. Once again, that's an inanimate object, so that's not dealing with sin, but it makes atonement. And chapter 45, verse 15, it's referring to the people of God for ritual cleansing for serving in the temple. So there it is referring to people. And then 45:17, it refers to the house of Israel for ritual cleansing for serving. But it doesn't say it's in reference to their sin, which seems to be a pretty significant omission. I would say this, just to simplify it, that the ceremonial view has nothing to do with the forgiveness of sins. None of Ezekiel's sacrifices have to do with the forgiveness of sins. So you say, well, what do they have to do with? Well, there is a temporary ceremonial cleansing for non-glorified people that is required in the millennium for them to be able to serve in the temple or draw near to the temple. And what you have in the temple is you have people who are resurrected and glorified, but you also have people who've not yet received resurrected bodies, who are still having children. And that's why you have a passage like Isaiah 65:20 that says, the child who dies at 100, or the person who dies at 100 will be thought accursed. And people are still being born during this time. And so that's because there's some people who are non-glorified. And if you have a problem with that, then you have the problem with Jesus' ministry after his resurrection. He's glorified and he's around people. So the space-time continuum doesn't end when there's a glorified person with a non-glorified person together. So there seems to relate to that ceremonial cleansing in part for that. And so the big point to take away is that these don't have to do with forgiveness of sins, like we would say internal cleansing, but rather refer to external ceremonial purification, if you want to put it that way. Okay, how do we understand that? And some of the objections. Well, let me just put it this way.
So
Yep.
you're inclined to embrace the ceremonial view?
Yes, I think, and here's why. Okay, so here's one reason. At one point in Ezekiel, they offer a grouping of sacrifices that occur all on one day. And really the only other time that happens is in Leviticus 7 and 8. And those same grouping happen on one day. And it's for the event of the consecration of the priesthood. It's not for their sin, it's for their setting apart. They're being ceremonially consecrated. And so that's what's taking place for them. It's also, I think, talked about in Exodus 29, where all these particular grouping of sacrifices are listed at once, on one day. And that seems to be what's happening, at least in one of the parts of Ezekiel, where these sacrifices are being, as the temple is being prepared, it gets to this point where they offer all these sacrifices on one day. It's like, well, what's that all about? Well, here's what it's about. Exodus 19, verse 6, God said this was his intention for Israel, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God's intention for Israel was to be a kingdom of priests. They were to have a function to the other nations like a priest, and to serve them, and to have this ministry to them. And what is happening in Ezekiel 40 to 48 is finally it happens. The entire nation is consecrated to serve in this function as a priest to the nations. And actually Isaiah confirms this idea that the whole nation will then be priests. Let's see here. I have it in my notes. I just got to find it. Yeah, okay. So Isaiah 61, verse 6. But you shall be called the priests of Yahweh. They shall speak of you as the ministers of our God. You shall eat the wealth of the nations, and in their glory you shall boast. Instead of your shame, there shall be a double portion. Instead of dishonor, they shall rejoice in their lot. Therefore, in their land, they shall possess a double portion. They shall have everlasting joy. So he's talking about Israel here, and they shall be called priests. And so here, I think, is the moment in Ezekiel 40-48 where God is consecrating them. He's setting apart the nation through all these sacrifices that happen in one day for this particular purpose, not for forgiveness of sins, but for cleansing. Not for forgiveness of sins, but for a setting apart for this role to have to the nations. Okay, a couple other things that I think help with this view. There's a number of omissions that Ezekiel leaves out in his description of his temple and of the sacrificial system that are absolutely essential for the Mosaic system, the Levitical system. And one that is incredibly glaring in its absence is the Day of Atonement. Ezekiel talks about how there'll be a celebration of the Passover, of the Feast of Tabernacles, but there's no mention of the Day of Atonement. And you think, well, why would that be? Well, because Ezekiel's talking in a new covenant context, a new covenant temple, and the ultimate sacrifice of which the Day of Atonement looked forward to was the death of Christ. That is where internal cleansing for sin happened. And so there's no need. If there were the Day of Atonement, that would be the offense to the work of Christ. And so, but Ezekiel mentions nothing of the Day of Atonement. It's not there. Not only that, the Ark of the Covenant is not there. And this is not just, it's not there. But Jeremiah 3:16 tells us explicitly that it won't be there. And when you have multiplied and increased in the land, in those days, declares Yahweh, they shall no more say, the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh, it shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of Yahweh, and all the nations shall gather to it. To the presence of Yahweh in Jerusalem, and they shall no more stubbornly follow their own evil heart. So, and he talks about the union of Israel and Judah then. So,
what was that reference?
that's you can remember it easy. It's Jeremiah 3:16, the 3:16s of the Bible. So, no Ark of the Covenant. Now, the significant part of the Ark is that it had on top of the mercy seat, the lid, which was the place where propitiation happened for sin. And so there will be none of that because the work of propitiation has been done for sinners. So that's completed. There's no need for the Day of Atonement. There's no lampstand. There's no veil. There's no high priest mention. There's a lot of big omissions that show us that, number one, this has nothing to do with the Mosaic covenant. This is a new covenant temple. And not only that, this has nothing to do with the forgiveness of sins internally for reconciliation to God because it's a new covenant context. These are people who've experienced the new birth. They've experienced regeneration. The Spirit indwells them. So what is it about? Well, part of it is just worship because there can be sacrifices that don't have to do with sin that can just be for worship because as Leviticus sets that up, 3 of the 5 don't relate to sin. But also, one aspect of it is the setting apart of Israel as a priestly people to serve as a function to the other nations. So then the question is, well, does this harmonize with Hebrews? And you're like, actually it does, because the author of Hebrews' argument is this: you cannot go back to Judaism. You cannot go back to the Mosaic covenant because the Mosaic covenant is obsolete. It's done. It's over. The new covenant is what you need to embrace. And that's exactly Ezekiel's point. Ezekiel is not saying, let's go back to the Mosaic covenant and go back to the Levitical system. He's saying this is a whole new deal. Ezekiel is trying to say, it never worked, guys, with the Mosaic covenant. You could never be the people God intends you to be with the Mosaic covenant because the Mosaic covenant doesn't come with batteries included. You need a new heart. You need the Spirit indwelling you. And so that's why Ezekiel constantly pushes them forward to, you need the new covenant. You need to experience the covenant of peace. And when you do, only then can you have this temple with the Messiah there and function to the nations as God always intended you to. And so Ezekiel has the exact same message, I would say, as the author of Hebrews does. So they're not in conflict with each other, but they're in harmony. The author of Hebrews also seems to indicate that the superiority of the work of Christ to have internal cleansing, while also acknowledging that some of the sacrifices only dealt with the defilement of the flesh. In other words, ceremonial external cleansing. So he even seems to agree that there was something happening externally that made atonement, but it didn't address the heart. That's what needed to happen. And so that's what the new covenant does in the work of Christ. I probably missed a bunch of stuff, but that's okay. I'm going to land the plane here. Here's one other little just fascinating thing. I don't know where you want to put this in your theology, but people who have such a big problem with sacrifices after the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Christ, there's this interesting little occasion in Acts 21 where Paul goes to the temple and he pays for sacrifices for two guys who are probably fulfilling a Nazirite vow, which once again, mind you, did not have to do with sin. It was consecration to God. So once again, a category not dealing with sin, but sacrifice. And so Paul goes and they're saying, hey, people have wrong views of you, Paul. We think this would be a good idea that you should go and just go with these guys at the temple and pay their fare. It'll show them that you're not just this big antagonist. And so Paul does it in Acts 21. And a whole big uproar. They accuse him of different things. But the text never says that Paul's wrong in doing that. Now, certainly if Paul was encouraging the celebration of the Day of Atonement, I think that would be a big problem. But he doesn't. It has to do with these guys fulfilling their Nazirite vow. And he pays their sacrifices, pays for their sacrifices. So post-ascension, Paul participates at least in the current system that had to do with dedication to God in this particular Nazirite vow. So to me, that gives me a little bit more encouragement that this is not like the anathema, like spitting on the atonement of Christ, like Sam Storm seems to say, because Paul has some engagement with the system that's by and large defunct and will be over when 70 AD happens. But so as far as purposes, I think it's a visible demonstration of the dwelling place of God. It's a place of teaching and instruction for the nations. It's the location of the Davidic throne. It's a place of global worship where the nations will come at different times for singing, for sacrifice, a house of prayer, as Jesus said, instruction, praise, giving. And it will be a demonstration to the nations of God's faithfulness. Because throughout Ezekiel, and here's where we can end, throughout Ezekiel, God punishes Israel to say, I'm going to do this so the nations know, right? So that they know. But then, when God restores them, it says this in Ezekiel 37. We already read this, but just to bring it back again. Ezekiel 37:28. It says this, then the nations will know that I am Yahweh who sanctifies Israel, and my sanctuary is in their midst forever. And so this is going to be a demonstration to the nations. In other words, why would that be it? Because they failed in all their other times in history, but finally they're regenerated. They love God from the heart. There's this new temple, and they're functioning as God intended them per Exodus 19 as a kingdom of priests, and they're serving the other nations and benefiting them and blessing them. And the nations go, God is so faithful to his promises. He didn't forget them. He gave them their land. He used them as he intended to use them, and he brought them under the covenant of peace. And they praise God for it. So it'll be a great cause for worship. So I'll end with Jason Beale's comment. He says this, it is not a regression back to previous sanctuaries under a Mosaic covenant, but a progression and advancement of the biblical storyline befitting God's glorious kingdom. So we'll end there.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So any questions or comments? I mean, I will say this is a tough issue, and I've wrestled with it for years, and I